Good morning, classmates and Annabelle. This is my little speech to go along with my Prezi presentation, and it solidifies all the things that are asked for in the presentation assignment. A couple things I just want to start with, just because I think that's important. A little bibliography, because there really isn't a little intelligent place to put the bibliography. So today I'm going to be presenting about Paulo and Freire and Augusto Boal. Mostly it's Augusto Boal's theory of teaching, which is largely utilized in my world of theater, and I had actually never read or studied the inspiration of that theory. So a couple of books that I used for this research, in addition to finally reading The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, are Playing Boal, Theater, Therapy, and Activism, which was edited by Maddie Schutzman and Jan Cohen-Cruz, and it was published by Routledge, London and New York in 2002. The other book that I utilize a lot in my work is Augusto Boal's work, Games for Actors and Non-Actors, translated by Adrian Jackson, which most of his work is translated by Adrian Jackson, and it was published by, again, Routledge, London and New York in 1992, and it's a common book that a lot of theater artists and people who work in therapy use in their teaching. But I think it's also important to note that this book is awesome for anybody who wants to use the stuff I'm talking about today in their own classroom. This is the go-to practitioner book. Of course, as promised, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo and Freire, with an introduction by Donald Macedo, who I also thought was really great. It was the 30th anniversary edition, published by Continuum in London and New York once again. Originally published in 1970 and 1993 by Paulo and Freire, a little bit before he died. And then there was a 30th anniversary edition published in 2000 with the introduction by Donaldo Macedo, which is the one I read. Exciting. Lastly, for anybody who's, again, interested for a good practitioner book, is Augusto Boal's book, The Rainbow of Desire, The Boal Method of Theater and Therapy, translated again by Adrian Jackson, and published by Routledge, yet again, and in 1995. Yay. And, of course, our class wouldn't be complete without any lovely representations of how the brain learns, 4th edition by David A. Sousa, and that was published, of course, just recently by Corin in 2011. All right, so got that out of the way. I'll do that again at the end of the presentation to remind us all of these fun and festive books. So, when I was given this assignment, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but it was funny as I went along in David Sousa's book as I read. I kept noting things that applied to the work that I, of course, do, which is theater. And then I thought, okay, theory I could go ahead and research further would naturally be Paulo Freire, because we didn't cover him in this class, and I have actually never read his book, and I practice the inspiration of his work through Boal, so why not go to the foundation of the work and know what the theory is and the vocabulary of the theory, which really wasn't a big difference from Boal, but oh well, I've read it now. The reason I chose Boal and Freire, besides the fact that I just kept writing it in the margins of my Sousa book, was because it has been extraordinarily successful in most of my work in multi-generational work and intercultural work. And we've talked a lot about that in this class, and I think for anybody who's looking for a go-to vocabulary for intercultural communications and theory and practitioner vocabulary for that work, this is the go-to thing to do. Also, I just had a lot of commonalities with Freire. When I was reading his book, it made sense to me because he was somebody who didn't particularly start out poor. You know, he wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but a certain thing happened and caused them to be a lot poorer, and he had more in common with a lot of the poverty he grew up around in Recife, Brazil. I also think that if students are stressed out, and Sousa covers this in his book as well, they don't learn in the same way. And it's not intelligent as a teacher to assume that they can't learn, but there's a different vocabulary that needs to happen with these particular students. And I think that this is the vocabulary that helps with that. The intended audience for this work can be anybody who works with at-risk youth, and in this day and age, I think there is always a percentage of at-risk youth in every classroom. Anyone who wants more techniques that utilize higher order thinking, because this work is really in the higher order thinking world of analysis, evaluation, and create. And anybody who teaches communications and theater. So there we go. Teaching and learning strategies of this theory that I have found as I was reading and connected back to the stuff we've been learning are Gardner's multiple intelligences of visual, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, intra and interpersonal skills, intelligences, positive transference, or that idea in Sousa's book of accepting or rejecting new learning. And it's funny because Freire, he really talks about this like he utilizes the vocabulary and the theory of love. So that positive transference is talked about in regards to love, but it's still the same idea. The importance of observation, or what Freire calls thematic investigations, and those thematic investigations then can be utilized in the classroom. I'll go into more of that in the techniques part of my speech. Whole child learning, which is covered by several of the people we've read. We didn't necessarily learn about Waldorf, but that's something that I have been trained in, and the whole child learning process that was also covered in Sousa's book. From Sousa's book, it's specifically not just the learning techniques. I also found that sense memory is covered a lot in this work. A quote that I liked that touches upon this is in Sousa's book on page 19. The emotional component is recalled whenever memory is recalled. This explains why people recalling a strong emotional memory will often experience those emotions again. The interactions between the amygdala and the hippocampus ensure that we remember for a long time that those events that are important and emotional. I find this happens all the time when I'm acting. You somehow have a memory of something, you're not really using it, it applies to what you're doing in the character, or it applies to what you're doing when you're directing and suggesting character development to your students. But this also goes back to that idea of positive transference, or even negative transference, because I found a couple times I remember things and I'll remember them forever and never forget them because there was an emotional response. So sense memory is something that's also used in the work that we talk about in film and theater that is the most common vocabulary, which is Stanislavski's sense memory work. And it's funny that it's actually in this brain study as to how that works. But this also works, of course, in Boal's work and Freire's work. Mirror neurons, which I find extraordinarily fascinating. And again, another quote from Sousa on page 23. Neuroscientists believe these mirror neurons may help an individual to decode the intentions and predict the behavior of others. They allow us to recreate the experience of others within ourselves and to understand others' emotions and empathize. Seeing the look of disgust or joy on other people's faces causes mirror neurons to trigger similar emotions in us. And Boal's work, which I'll go into the actual specifics of image theater and form theater, make the students step into the life of somebody else or themselves, and they have to re-experience those things, which are almost like an elaborative rehearsal, also discussed in Sousa's book. But mirror neurons are super fascinating for a theater artist to think about, that when I am acting with somebody, I tell my students all the time, 90% of acting is listening. All the other stuff is homework. Your memorization is homework, your blocking is homework, the research you have done is homework. But when you're on stage, you have to be paying attention to your acting partner, which simply could be just the audience. But what they're doing has to affect what is happening to you, and it can't be the same every night. You cannot predict it. And it's fascinating because you feel it as a person. You almost feel mirror neurons, I think. I mean, I think that seems kind of hokey, but I think it's true. I've always thought this and never really had a word for it. Objectives. This is part of the criteria of long-term storage, and Freire has this idea of thematic investigations where there's a theme about what they're going to observe as a group of teachers and then utilize that in the classroom. And that comes again from observation. And that observation and the name that's attached to it, naming the moment, is another thing that is an offshoot of Freire's work. But that objective creates that criteria for long-term storage. Forming the memory, again, when you're using Boal's work or Freire's work, when you're doing the dialectic and you're discussing things, you are forming memories that are coming from the student, not from the teacher. Both of them are happening. It's a horizontal process. There's nobody in charge. There's no hierarchy. It's both people. And there's a lot of things in the book about, Freire's book, I'm speaking of, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that talks about reminding the teacher that they're not in charge, and if they think they are, they're not going to learn anything, and it is their job to learn as much as the student, and the student will only learn if the teacher is also learning, and it's that horizontal process that is the most important. If you form memories, according to Sousa, and I believe this as well, you develop more neurons, and the more neurons create less decay in the memory, and it will be a long-term memory. So if you're teaching in dialectic, if you are brave enough and have enough time to sit down and talk about a theme that day, it doesn't always have to be about oppression, of course, but just thinking about this in the classroom in general, dialectics create memories. Conversations create memories, and that also creates long-term memory. So I think it's important to think about the more we discuss things with our students, and the more we don't feel like we are condescending to them, but really trying to learn from them as well, we're going to create something that's going to last. Drama is covered, not particularly specifically in the arts section of chapter 5 of Sousa's book, but it does mention that, or I deduced from my reading, of course, with the utilization of me teaching musical theater and Shakespeare and a variety of other things, that drama is in the limbic system, and it's also in both hemispheres. And I think it's best talked about on page 181, where they talk about females and males and their left hemisphere and where their language processors are. And it really talks about here that these kind of things are great for, and this is brain organization, chapter 5. I made a mess up. The arts is not till chapter 6. But you had the Broca's and the Wernicke's area, and then you also are having the cerebellum be affected. It's drama. It's really a whole brain process, and you have your memorization that's in your working memory and in some parts of your long-term memory that you're utilizing, and then the images that you have to create that are coming here, and then in your motor cortex. It's a complete utilization of the brain. I could go into that in more detail, but I'm trying to edit here. So, moving on. Movement is inescapably linked to learning. This is Sousa, page 238. If they are moving, if they have a kinesthetic response, which image theater and form theater in the Theater for the Oppressed, TO is what they call it, so I'll refer to it as TO from now on, which is, of course, inspired by Freire's work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is movement, and it is using language, and it is using themes, and it is using observation. All of these things put together are inescapably linked to learning, and I think that that's important to think about. Verbs. In all theater, for some reason, we always talk in verbs, and it's fascinating to learn that in Sousa's book, the verbs actually activate more of the brain, page 257 in his book. And it's great. In image theater, you want a verb for what you're going to create, and then sometimes after it's a frozen image, it can move. I didn't really find a really good example of it to put on the Prezi, but it's how I start Boal's work, as I usually start in image work, which is funny because he developed it later. But it's always movement, and form theater is movement, and allowing what he calls the spectactors, which are the spectators, of course, kind of a funny pun, to come on stage and fix the scene that the actors have actually presented to them. And, you have this guy who's called the Joker, or that's the teacher in our classroom. The Joker then says, hey, audience, what do you think? Did you think that this represents what you think about your learning or what you think about your oppression? And then it allows the student or the spectator to come up and fix it. And wow, having a moment where you're having to create language, have movement, boss people around, and teach it to them in the moment. And we know when you teach, you actually learn more when you're teaching. The student is doing that. They're going to obviously have more of a long-term memory and less decay occurring for that memory. Lastly, I think there was a moment where I wrote down that another learning strategy in here is thinking as a representational system. And it's the recognition of diversity that has led to the notion of multiple intelligences. These strategies that are used in Freire's work and Boal's work are representational systems, and those representational systems do lead to multiple intelligences. And the more balanced your brain is, the more balanced your multiple intelligence is, I think the better it is in general. That was Sousa, page 252. Okay, so quick bios. Paulo and Freire, which is, this is a paraphrasing and somewhat of quoting from the Richard Shaw intro in his book. He was born in 1921 in Recife, the center of one of the most extreme situations of poverty and underdevelopment in the Third World. He was soon forced to experience that reality directly, as I have mentioned earlier, as to my connection with him. As the economic crises in 1929 in the United States began to affect Brazil, the precarious stability of Freire's middle-class family gave way, and he found himself sharing the plight of what he called the wretched of the earth. This had a profound influence on his life, and he came to know the gnawing pangs of hunger and fell behind in school because of the listlessness it produced. It also led him to make a vow at age 11 to dedicate his life to the struggle against hunger, so that other children would not have to know the agony he was then experiencing. His early sharing of the life of the poor also led him to the discovery of what he describes as the culture of silence. And we've talked about this culture of silence in some of our conversations online, our discussions of how, often like the parent, when it's, the teacher is talking to them in a parent-teacher conference, won't argue. They just won't. There is a culture of silence, of the dispossessed. And it became clear to him that the whole educational system was one of the major instruments for the maintenance of this culture of silence. From his influences, he wrote his philosophy of education in 1959 in his doctoral dissertation at the University of Recife, and later in his work as professor of the history and philosophy of education in the same university, as well as experiments with illiterates in that same city. So he had empirical evidence, he had a variety of brain evidence that he worked on, and he was also teaching this and writing about it when he was coming up with his theory. Then his theories were suddenly being used widely by the Catholics and other literacy campaigns throughout Northeast Brazil, and then was considered a threat, and he was jailed after a military coup in 1964. He went on to work in Chile, he went on to work throughout Europe, and what's funny is Augusto Boal has not the same story, but he has the same story of being imprisoned, and he wrote his book, Theater of the Oppressed, after his experience of going to jail. Brazilian Dr. Augusto Boal, and this is from a biography online, a brief biography by Doug Patterson, was raised in Rio de Janeiro. He was formerly trained in chemical engineering and attended Columbia University in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Although his interest and participation in theater began at an early age, it was just after he finished his degree at Columbia that he was asked to return to Brazil to work at the Arena stage in Sao Paulo. His work at the Arena Theater led to his experimentation with new forms of theater that would have an extraordinary impact on traditional practice. And then, I'll go into more of him, but basically he took his work, and he wasn't a poor kid. He just somehow loved people in general and wanted them to be inspired in the same way he was by Paulo's work, and he then came up with a theater method utilizing that. He first developed what he calls the Joker system, and that is essentially the teacher who's talking in between what they're watching or reading, and then discussing it, and somewhat being a devil's advocate, or, you know, there's all sorts of theories and philosophies about the Joker, but that's the Joker system, and his book is pretty elaborate in that. And for a while, then he got rid of the Joker system, and then it comes back. You see that a lot with a lot of theater practitioner theorists. Then he developed forum theater, which is where you create something that's on a theme and present it to an audience, and then ask the audience what they think of it. And then they can be the actors. They can fix it and go in. He then created image theater, which is physical expression of an oppression. Or, you know, you could just use it for class. It could be a physical expression of, you know, a math problem. And you can ask, and you see this in math classes a lot, that I've observed, of course. They'll put it on the board and they'll ask the student to fix it. Well, why don't you make it fun? You know, don't make it like the shaming device. It's, okay, well, you got it. Can you ask, you know, call in for a friend, or can you call in for help? Make it like a game show. I think forum theater feels a lot like a game show sometimes when I've observed it or when I've taught it. Then he developed invisible theater, and he developed invisible theater, which is kind of fascinating because of the cops in the streets. And then later he has this concept of the cops in the head. And those are those little critics that are in our students' heads or in our own heads that are telling us that we suck and that, you know, we negative transference and we're never going to learn and blah, 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 blah. But this cops in the street was literal, and they were threatening to throw him behind bars, and they essentially did. And so he created invisible theater, which were these things where they went into the public and played characters with other people around them and did these oppressive themes, and no one were the wiser. It's almost kind of like a flash mob of acting, I guess. I mean, obviously flash mobs came later, but that's what they were doing, because he couldn't do real theater because he kept getting in trouble and being thrown behind bars. Cop in the Head was developed after he moved to Europe, and he sort of was judgmental, had a bias against Europeans. He thought, oh, you've never experienced poverty, or you've never seen third world conditions. How could you have oppression? And then he started spending time with them because he had to make money, and so he's using his methods on these people, and he realizes that the suicide rates are high, and that the cop in the head, not the cops in the streets, are just as oppressive as the cops in the street. And so he came up with a whole system that then his wife started to use in her psychotherapy career, and that's where this Rainbow of Desire book comes from. And that's used largely for therapy, but it comes from this other work as well. Then lastly, he developed the Rainbow of Desire, which is from his wife's work. The Cop in the Head worked into the Rainbow of Desire work. And then he decided that theater wasn't enough, art wasn't enough, that you had to actually be a politician. So he started to do legislative theater, which takes laws that are in, you know, they're gobbledygook, and he took them to the streets and was like, okay, do you understand this? Because I don't. And basically took laws to the people who were illiterate and let them learn about it. And it's fascinating because I was actually a long time ago prepping somebody for their Fulbright, and we were reading some things, and I came across the fact that there are theater troops in the Congo and in Uganda that have theater troops that go out to the villages to explain the laws, and it's from legislative theater methods of Boal. And it's just funny how the diaspora has created from Freire's work into the work that I do, and then subsequently, I guess, the work that people do all over the world. The roots of this work are, sorry, let me find it. His experience of hunger, of course, inspired it. And then he argued that a thorough understanding of oppression must always take a detour through some form of class analysis. And through observation and research of class, you can understand your students or the people who are trying to learn from you. He denounced the neoliberal position that promotes the end of history and the end of class. He always steps in and says, no, we are not over this. Or, lately you've been reading because we have President Obama, suddenly we're apparently in a post-racial society, which is absurd. But he had those same opinions. He would always step in and say, no, this is never going away. This is a part of the way we think, and this is the way it's going to be, and you need to teach to that. To pretend that it went away is stupid. He rejected oppression and being reduced to a discussion on race. He thought it was mostly class. And I think it's great because I used to teach Dr. Cornel West's work when I was an intercultural communications teacher at the college level, and it's funny, he's moved to that as well. His Race Matters is his, seminal work, but it's his work on class that is what he's been doing lately, and he's gone back to that belief as well. He was, of course, influenced by Karl Marx, Gramsci, Hegel, Sartre, Monnier, Erich Fromm, Louis Althusser, Ortega y Gasset, Mao, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Che Guevara, Unamuno, and Marcuse. So there was a lot of communist leanings in there, but I think regardless of anybody's bias of communism, the stuff works. I'll attest to it. It works. A quote that I liked by Donaldo Macedo, who did the 2000 intro to Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed 30th Anniversary Edition. He said he was committed to imagine a world that is less ugly, more beautiful, less discriminatory, more democratic, less dehumanizing, and more humane. He was an intellectual who fights against the temptation of being a populist intellectual. I think that's great because when we talked about Montessori, it was the individual that you wanted to focus on, and you see that also in Paulo's work. Freire's work obviously is the root of Boal's work, so I'm not going to go into that work. I am going to quickly try to go into the technique. I think the most important thing to think about is the things that it is not. And I think that also talks about what the technique and the theory is. There's consistent misunderstandings of Freire's work and his methods, and one of them is it's a reductionist view of identity, that it reduces the identity of people, and I think that's stupid. That's not at all what he was talking about. He was talking about the individual as the individual, not in a communist sense. It was really, you need to focus on the person. There's also a misunderstanding of the polarizing binarisms, and that there are sides, and there's no sides. It's horizontal. It's a horizontal process. Student, teacher, learn at the same level from each other. There's also huge misunderstandings of the thing that is the most important part of his theory, which is the dialect. The dialectic, not dialect as in, an accent, but the dialogical teaching, where you're teaching in a conversation. And there's a quote that Macedo, again, the guy who did the intro to the 30th anniversary version, that Freire's dialogical teaching that people refuse to link experiences to the politics of culture and the critical democracy, thus reducing their pedagogy to a form of middle-class narcissism. It's not a narcissistic thing where somebody is teaching and be like, I'm going to help these people. And if you do think that, and I think Freire also said that often he caught himself thinking that, and Boal has also had opportunities where he said he switched his thinking based on the opportunity of, I'm not the smartest person in the room currently, and theater would be better if I actually asked the people in the room what they thought. It is not narcissistic. And when it becomes narcissistic, and I think it's a good lesson for those of us moving into teaching or are currently teaching, if your teaching becomes narcissistic, then you need to get out. It's not about you. It's about the student. So I think that there is a misunderstanding about that there's a little bit of pitying going on and that we're saving the oppressed. Not smart. Biases and the inability to read the work based on the ideology. I will admit it is a bit heavy. It's a heavy piece of work. There's a lot of words you have to, but when they're in context with the way that it was translated, it doesn't make a lot of sense, so you're re-looking things up. Yeah. And then in Macedo's introduction, he talked about the fact that he gave it to somebody who then gave it to her son, and he was like, well, how did he understand it? And she said, he just did. People will understand it if they want to, and I'll say the work is heavy to read, but that doesn't mean the techniques are bad. So taking a misunderstanding of his work based on the fact that his work is hard to read, again, not the brightest choice. Praxis. Praxis is one of the important vocabularies of this work. It's also what we use in playwriting. So I liked that idea that Aristotle's work is in this work as well, and it's a vocabulary I know and practice regularly. Praxis sort of has that mnemonic device of practice, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. It's the art of what your journey is to learn something. And you need reflection and action at the same time. Again, that's a huge part of his theory, reflection and action. There are two distinct stages to teaching. There are the confrontation, and the oppressed unveil the world of oppression through the praxis, commit themselves to transformation. So just being in the classroom is a commitment, and that the reality of oppression has already been transformed. This pedagogy ceases to belong to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. That once someone makes the choice to better themselves and to transform themselves, they then join the community of people who are already doing that. That's all from Freire's book, pages 54 to 55. I think the major things of his theory that are important to remember is that it's a conversation. It's always a dialectic, that you find thematic things from observation, you bring those into the classroom, and you utilize them in your lesson plans, and you utilize their life. What a concept, actually getting to know your students and making sure that your lesson plans apply to the things that matter to them or that maybe oppress them, because oppression creates an energy in the room. And I know this to be true when I've taught Native American students and I ask them what oppresses them, and I'll write all these things on the board, and then we'll create image theater from it or form theater from it, and suddenly I can use that in math, I can use that in English, because suddenly I have a jumping off point to something that matters to them. Again, Freire is really famous for his idea of the banking system, which is where, it's like the ready-to-wear approach, and it obviates thinking. So reminds me of No Child Left Behind. So the banking system that, or the quote is, of course, the scope of action allowed the students and extends only as far as receiving, filing, and storing the deposits. That we're depositing something in there, and hopefully it'll store, and hopefully they'll receive it. Yeah. Anyway, the main things to remember for his technique are dialogue. It's reflection and action at the same time. Horizontal teaching, that the teacher and the student are learning together. Observation, or what he calls thematic investigations. And the last part is just a lot of the idea of praxis. What is the journey of the student? And you need to care about that. And the communion of what you've been teaching with them and how that applies back to their praxis and your own praxis. I think it's also important to think about, have you lost your praxis as a teacher, and make sure that you have it. The techniques for Boal I've already mentioned, form theater, the Joker system, image theater. There are some offshoots, naming the moment, which comes from popular education, and popular education grew out of Freire's work as well. There's a lot of offshoots, but I think what I would say is that have some fun in the classroom. Utilize these things, because there is a lot of Bloom's taxonomy, there's a lot of Vygotsky's work in here, Montessori's work, Waldorf's work, Gardner's multiple intelligences. It utilizes the whole brain. Why not do that? Because it creates a representational system that is going to be the criteria for long-term storage. And ultimately, you know, there's this thing toward the end of Freire's book where they talk about living corpses, and that you don't want your students to be living corpses. And I feel that in the room. I don't know if it's just because I'm a theater person, but when I look out into the classroom and I have an apathetic stare, I worry, you know, and at that point I do step in and I ask the counselor of my school to help me, to step in, and we need to find out how to connect this kid to something, because nobody wants to teach a living corpse. Biography briefly again. David Sousa, How the Brain Learns, 4th edition. Augusto Boal's The Rainbow of Desire. Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Augusto Boal's Games for Actors and Non-Actors, which has a lot of the image work, forum work, and everything. And Playing Boal, which has a lot of different practitioners who use him. It's not his writing. There's only 2 things that he wrote in here, and they're really short. But it's other people from other countries, and so there's a lot of intercultural experiences of how this work applies into different situations. Not just therapy, not just theater. So this is a real fun thing to go to. Thank you so much. Sorry this is long, but you can just skip ahead or not. All right, thanks.